Hello, everyone out there in the virtual realm. It wasn't that long ago that I was sitting in a classroom not too dissimilar, struggling through my English assessments, trying to learn about poetry, and being gifted the experience of two very exceptional English teachers who, for better or worse, led to me studying English at university at an undergraduate level, and then pursuing it further and studying it at PhD level and writing my thesis on a couple of English authors. But today I'm going to talk to you about poetry and sound. So there are two things that I want you to take away from today. A greater awareness of the sounds going on around you. And secondly, a new appreciation of poetry as something that speaks to us of the complexity of ordinary experience. Both these things are cheap, empowering, and easy to perform. They are practices or approaches to life that will grow through your nourishing them. The idea of interpreting a poem often strikes fear into people's hearts. They worry too much that they won't make the correct interpretation, that the language is too cryptic or obscure, that they miss the message or don't receive the signal. It is true that in part this is due to the value placed on obscurity in modernist poetics, poems that seem like riddles without solutions. But it's also due to taking the wrong steps as interpreters of poems. Poetry is the most direct way to account for the complexity of perceptual experience. Our use of language is first and foremost poetic. We are often poetic in our day-to-day lives, when we come up with nicknames for our pets, when we shape expressions so they take on multiple meanings, when we experience that sense of words striking sparks off our feeling and thinking. When we make language our own and share this through expression. As interpreters of poems, we need to take this awareness into our analysis and understand that the poet is merely trying to find the best description for that vague, unmanageable, fleeting, mixed, miraculous, perplexing sense that we are perspectives on a world and that the world exists inside us. I want to begin today's talk by reading a poem. It's not a poem by the poet I plan to focus on today, Martin Harrison, who's an Australian poet, but it's a poem that means a lot to him. Martin taught me at university, at UTS in 2005 and 2006, and this poem that I'm about to read to you has stayed in my mind since then. When I came to teaching my own students at university, at the beginning of last year, one of the first things I did was read this poem to the class. Sure enough, one of my students approached me after class and told me how the poem really blew her away. That student is now in her honours year at UWS, studying poetry. I don't want to pretend it's anything like the tune emitted from the Pied Piper's flute, but it's a very good poem. So this is called A Brief Pause in the Organ Recital by a Swedish poet called Thomas Tranströmer. The organ stops playing and it's deathly quiet in the church, but only for a couple of seconds. And the faint rumbling penetrates from the traffic out there, that greater organ. For we are all surrounded by the murmuring of the traffic. It flows along the cathedral walls. The outer world glides there like a transparent film with shadows struggling pianissimo. And as if it were part of the street noise, I hear one of my pulses beating in the silence. I hear my blood circulating, the cascade that hides inside me, that I walk about with. And as close as my blood and as far away as a memory from when I was 4, I hear the trailer that rumbles past and makes the 600-year-old walls tremble. This could hardly be less like a mother's lap, yet at the moment I am a child, hearing the grown-ups talking far away, the voices of the winners and the losers mingling. On the blue benches, a sparse congregation, and the pillars rise like strange trees. No roots, only the common floor. No crown, only the common roof. I relive a dream that I'm standing alone in a churchyard. Everywhere, heather glows as far as the eye can reach. Who am I waiting for? A friend. Why doesn't he come? He's here already. Slowly death turns up the lights from underneath, from the ground. The heath shines a stronger and stronger purple. No, a colour no one has seen, until the morning's pale light winds in through the eyelids. And I awaken to that unshakable perhaps that carries me through the wavering world. And each abstract picture of the world is as impossible as the blueprint of a storm. At home stood the all-knowing encyclopedia, a yard of bookshelf. In it I learnt to read. But each one of us has his own encyclopedia written. It grows out of each soul. It's written from birth onwards. The hundreds of thousands of pages stand pressed against each other, and yet with air in between them, like the quivering leaves in a forest, the book of contradictions. What's there changes by the hour, the pictures retouch themselves, the words flicker. A wake washes through the whole text. It's followed by the next wave, and then the next. There's a lot to say about this poem. Today, our interests will relate to the general question of what the poem accomplishes with regard to expressing or accounting for what takes place in a moment. What the poem teaches us is that even a humble pause, a break or opening up in the going on of things, even this can be a complex, multi-layered, dynamic interweaving of sense perceptions and residual affects, memories from childhood, fragments of last night's dream, different sounds blending and becoming distinct and fading again, the internal awareness of things like our breathing and our blood flow, the cooler and warmer regions of our body, the ghostly itches we feel on our skin, our lips resting on each other, the peculiar sensitivity of our teeth, the expanding and deflating hollows inside us. All of these things continue to happen, and our conscious awareness kind of dances among them, is itself a dance composed of them, sometimes dilating to include more information, sometimes contracting to focus on a particular homogeneous stream, me talking to you now, hearing my voice, translating words from the noise, busily thinking about how the words go together, relating them to ideas, then drifting away to a fragment of breakfast compacted in a molar, or the peculiar, intense, oily heat gathering in a face. Our attention is paradoxical. As soon as we attempt to fix our attention on a limited range of sense stimuli, we become distracted. We space out. So, in a sense, relentless focus breeds distraction. A certain kind of mindful distraction permits focus, directed but inclusive focus. Today we will look at the way some examples of poetry manage to encapsulate the mindful distraction that gets the best out of a moment, that does justice to the complexity of perceptual experience. I want to begin with a focus on sound. To this, I need to add the qualification that a focus on sound does not mean sound isolated from the other senses, but rather on what of the other senses gets mixed up with sound, or what sound is as part of a sensory atmosphere, a sensorium, that includes things like light, skin, movement, heat, coolness, and so on. The musicologist Victor Zuckerkandl suggests that in order to know what it means to hear, we should look to the sky. Sounds occur in atmospheres. Sounds are themselves atmospheres that we hear in, and the sky is the perfect example of an atmosphere that gets mistaken for something far off and distant, which we in fact exist in. It takes time and effort to adjust oneself to the sonic complexity of our surrounds. Often, the urban environment lacks the moments of complete silence that give our ears the chance to adjust so they can hear properly. Sounds need to diminish before we can adjust ourselves to them. The above poem emerges from a parting, a pause in the organ recital. We are sitting there with the poet in the church, listening but not quite paying attention to the sound of the organ, to what's taking place. We also need to remember that churches, at least older churches, unlike many buildings erected today, are deliberately built to provide room for music. As the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead notes, there can be no religion without music. Music provides the context for religious emotions to flourish. The poet and the church are tuned for sonic possibility. A pause is commonly defined as a stop or a break. Its more specific musical definition is a rest lengthened by an unspecified amount. This corresponds to the sense in the poem of a moment lengthening to include a potentially infinite constellation of moments. The pause is an opening up in the stream. At first it is described as silent, dead quiet. But from that relative silence, other sounds begin to emerge. The faint rumbling of the traffic out there, the sound of the poet's own blood flow, pulses beating in the silence, the sound of the traffic outside the church, distorted by the body of the church, its stone walls, mixing with the sound of the poet's body. The architectural boundaries distinguishing the inside and the outside of the church also overlap. The sonic environment created by the organ and the room, and the sonic environment created by the room and the traffic. Inside and outside, body and room and world, these things exist in a dynamic relationship. The poem takes place in a series of rooms that fit inside each other, not unlike Russian dolls. This sonic mapping of an environment gives us a very different description to that given by our vision. And yet, in our experience, sound and vision go together. It makes little sense isolating one from the other. The most accurate description of experience is always metaphorical. Light describes sound, and sound describes light. We can place more or less emphasis on the visual or the sonic, on light or sound, but as we do, and somewhat paradoxically, the more of the other senses it will come to include. As the academic and poetic historian Stephen Connor notes, and I'll be ventriloquising Stephen a bit today, the more dominant a particular sense, or the apparatus used to support and supply it may seem to be, the more it will implicate other senses, and therefore the more complex and the less pure its dominion will become. Sight often gives us a sense of stability that hearing does not. Sounds arrive and fade away. They blur into each other, becoming rumbles, murmurs, hums, scattered but persistent fragments going together. But they can also surprise us. Their sharp, unpredictable arrival. Twig snaps, staccato clacking. Sounds are arresting, though rarely clear, like objects of sight. In Transtromer's poem, the indistinctness of sound is what leads him from the present, which is really composed of multiple evolving moments, back into the past. Not the recent past of the trailer rumble that shakes the walls, but the distant past of his childhood, hearing the grown-ups talk far away. That vague sense we carry through our lives, perhaps most intense during childhood and recaptured through travel, that we are part of something large, some distant authority that we don't quite understand speaks to us. Familiar though foreign, distinct yet dim, multiple, mutable, commingling. Sound is more volatile than light, or at least our experience of hearing sound tends to be characterised by greater volatility than our experience of light. Sounds arrive and fade quickly. They are passing, indistinct, patchy, mixed. We hear sounds, and perhaps because of their fragility, their partiality, we are compelled to dutifully find out or compose accounts that adequately house them. As my go-to guy Stephen Connor notes once again, where we have a strong sense that we taste things in our mouths, or touch things with our hand or elbow, and that we see things, if not in our eyes exactly, then from what we call a particular point of view, we seem to hear things from where they are, rather than from where we are. Sounds leave us ungrounded. They have the capacity not only to transport us, or give the illusion to our visual sense of things that we are transported, but also to transform us, as we know from listening to music. There is no more speedy and convincing way to undergo an emotional change than through listening to music. Recall my earlier quotation about the central role music plays in religion. Music readies us for the transcendental by touching us with immersion. In light of this, it seems no accident that sound and the poet's commingled sense of both his body and the room as acoustic devices, is the prompt or vector that sends the poem on the trajectory from the moment of listening through a patchwork of memories, dream fragments, speculations, and imaginings. I wish to leave Transströmer for a moment at this juncture and devote the second part of this paper to the poetry of Martin Harrison. I want to focus on how Harrison offers poetic descriptions of place using sound and the ear as a guide. I want to outline the way these sound atmospheres account for the implication of the body and the environment, giving particular voice to the non-human world as something we not only listen to, but also hear with. What is the sound of heat? Is it the sound of a kettle, the sound of a flame crackling, the sound of water spilt on hot metal, hissing into the air, of puffing breath? Associations vary, but to the Australian ear, heat is rarely given a more compelling expression than in the relentless call of cicadas. Harrison's poem, An Elephant's Foot, gives a particularly insightful account of heat and cicadas experienced as togetherness through the human body. And I'll read his poem now. An Elephant's Foot. No cool place on the veranda, and once again the half-thought of fire. Even the metal ticks under the heat's weight. In trees, up back, the cicadas are noisy as electricity in a transformer. They burn through you, can't be avoided. They're too close on the ear, too amplified. Thousands of them hiss from the slope. They buzz non-stop like a jammed CD. Occasionally, one close by sprays out. It clicks mid-pitches, a barber's shaver, trimming sideburns on the skull. While way over, the predicted top, the heat's now powering up its empty hot plate. Its main purpose being erasure of depth, to be a destroyer of whatever's peripheral and delicate, as totally as an elephant's foot. By mid-morning, the temperature's a bloodstorm. One signal, there are hundreds of life change in the way trunks, branches, even grass stalks have got glued with tiny wrecked mandibles and paper car bodies. Black princes, yellow bakers, green grocers unzipping from them, flying off, giving 40 degrees its voice, till they throb an ear-splitting dry sea swell, raking long messages through the heat. No one can be out in, rasping more consonants and bushman's clicks than an ear absorbs, flittering out to an insect horizon whose sounds blaze, build, counterpoint. In a chorus of football fans who chant and sing across a stadium, it's said these sound curtains can bring on heart attacks. They take over, stimulate the pulse too much. They make environment. In fact, though, who was it? Invented the phrase wall of sound. Containment is practiced first in the ear, in what you trust, then in unheard voices no one resists. It's why, for a second, a stray temptation about how, in town, the supermarkets, corridors of packaged goods stay cooled, nudges into the mind like an absent wisp of cloud. Fresh passages, cold hums, cool music float on a surface whose deep features can't be tracked, consciously. A transparent fire front lodged in the cicada air. No choice but to take it on, be philosophical, or make humour out of these shadowy desires, even for aircon, for shade, for surf. After all, a phase where singularities are unmarked, in immersion of machine-noised air, is where one is and was. Like ripples of water die on arrival, noise is always more complex than speech. Cicadas blast volleys. They're precise. They deny transcendence. In this poem, we get a sense that the sound of the cicadas is overwhelming, impossible to escape, that it penetrates through the body, giving consciousness a particular tone or mood. The expression, "can't hear myself think," seems an apt phrase to apply to the sense here that the buzz of the cicadas is also a kind of dissolution of thought, And indeed, in Greek, the word for fly, ostras, also names a variety of madness or frenzy, with insect noise on occasion being used as a vehicle of torment by the Greek gods, something we can perhaps readily imagine from sleepless summer's nights swatting and attempting to ignore mosquitoes. Harrison is right to characterise loud, persistent noise as inescapable. Our ability to escape sound through blocking our ears is far less effective than closing our eyes to escape offensive light. As the philosopher Michel Serres notes in his typically poetic prose, looking leaves us free, listening imprisons us. We can free ourselves from a scene by lowering our eyelids or putting our fists over our eyes, by turning our back and taking flight. We cannot escape persistent clamour. No barrier or ball of wax is sufficient to stop it. Practically all matter, particularly flesh, vibrates and conducts sound. Harrison's cicadas are a prison of sound, an invisible room that makes a room of the poet. The cicadas produce sound curtains that are claimed to bring on heart attacks. Note the prominence given in the poem to the body as a medium for vibratory transformations. The buzz of a shaver against the skull, the pulse of blood flow. The barrier of the skin is a medium, a site of transmission and transformation, rather than an impervious border. As Michel Serres remarks later in the same book I quoted from just a moment ago, we hear by means of the skin and the feet. We hear with the cranial box, the abdomen and the thorax. We hear by means of the muscles, nerves and tendons. Our body box, stretched with strings, veils itself within a global tympanum. We live amid sounds and cries, amid waves rather than spaces the organism moulds and indents itself. I am a house of sound, hearing and voice at once. Black box and sounding board, hammer and anvil, grotto of echoes, a music cassette, the ear's pavilion, a question mark, wandering in the space of messages filled or stripped of sense. I am the resonance and the tone. I am altogether the mingling of the tone and its resonance. Both Harrison and Serres speak of the whole body as a kind of ear, shaped by the places that it passes through, or rather passes with. This is particularly evident when Harrison speaks of the skull as a medium for the clicks of the barber's shaver. It is not the ear alone that hears, but the body itself is an apparatus of surrogate ears which develop at the points where vibration is felt most intensely. To press a barber's shaver against the skull is to fashion a musical instrument out of the body, a drum made of stretched skin and bone, receiving and producing vibrations. And it might be worth noting here that cicadas and many other insects have ears not on the sides of their heads, but in their abdomens, and crickets have ears in their legs. The fragile, delicate, intricate structure of the inner ear, with its stretched skin and tiny bones, is replicated and enlarged in the head, the abdomen, and the foot. Indeed, now I think of it, there is perhaps something insect-like about the ear itself. This might be due to the tiny bones housed within it, which are reminiscent of the fragile legs and clicking wings of insects. Or perhaps it's a fact that insects, due to their smallness, are things we tend to hear rather than see. I recall more than one occasion trying to sleep and hearing what seems like an entire crowd of people walking on brittle plastic, only to discover it is nothing more than a wood beetle in a plastic bag. Or it might even be to do with the troubling idea that insects might find their way into our heads to nest while we sleep, or when otherwise unsuspecting, through the passageway of our ears. And I'm sure we're all familiar with unpleasant stories of this kind. And while there is certainly something disturbingly unusual about this idea, that insects might crawl inside our heads, it is in a sense true to say that when we hear a fly buzzing or a cicada making its rapid rattles, we are hearing that sound inside our heads. Either way, our hearing and insect life bear an intimate relation, which Harrison's poem makes apparent in a memorable fashion. Sight lends itself to the particular. To look is to ponder and to distinguish. The glistening red wheelbarrow, made famous in William Carlos Williams's poem, is an emblem of experience guided by sight. The things we see often have a sense of permanence and of standing out, whereas hearing, by contrast, tends to involve things as arrival and departure, things that address us through ephemeral envelopes. We see on or with screens while we hear in clouds. To hear is to wander or wind, to lose and to gain, to inhabit the immediacy that takes place in and as time, to be led by the fleeting. We hear in the realm of the multiple, where many indistinct sounds go together. The swarm, the chorus, the cacophony, the applause of crashing waves, the deep frothing of a jet in the sky. As Harrison emphasises, a phase where singularity is unmarked, in an immersion of machine-noised air. Indeed, it would seem that, in keeping with my earlier quote from Victor Zuckerkandl, the poet looks to the sky or the atmosphere, the climate or the temperature in order to hear. To say that singularity is unmarked means that through sound we hear the numerous and the indistinguishable. Hearing makes the idea of immersion or inness present to us. This feeling of inness is a very obvious but easy to forget characteristic of our experience. Easy to forget in part due to its obviousness, that it goes without saying. To exist is to be inside something. We exist in atmospheres. Vision sometimes misleads us into thinking that we exist apart from the places we move through. We forget the sense that we think, feel and perceive in mediums. Light and air, sunshine and wind. We are a sonic medium that exists among and within other sonic mediums. Vibrations travel through us, we emit vibrations. While we give voice through our mouths and by tapping and strumming, we have no such equivalent for light. We can make fire, sure, or light a candle, but we cannot, in Cyclops style, spray rays from visors in our heads. So our sense of hearing is perhaps well geared to exchanges rather than institutions, crossroads where what is made and what is received intermix. When we go for a swim, we have a distinct sense of being immersed in something. We are surrounded by liquid. We hear the engines of boats far off, sometimes loose rocks dragging along the bottom of the ocean. The unfamiliarity of the subaquatic world exemplifies what we experience more commonly in our terrestrial, or rather our atmospheric existence. Our bodies are immersed in air that is populated by vibratory signals from other beings. Perhaps this is why Harrison speaks of the ear-splitting dry sea swell, as though inviting us to consider the air as a medium characterised not by vacuousness, but by multiplicity. Harrison writes of the cicadas giving 40 degrees its voice. This apparently simple formulation masks an important program for the task of the poet. Poets give voices to places and things. This is not a matter of advocacy, whereby the voiceless are spoken for, but rather the recognition on the part of the poet that things have voices, that our perceptual experience is a cacophony of sounds that we both exist in and that exist inside us. We do not simply speak, we give voice. Our feeling, thinking and expression is first and foremost an act or event of giving, a gift that we, like the cicadas, celebrate having by continually offering it to the world. And that brings my presentation on sound and poetry for a close today. And if you have any questions now, I invite you to write them down and they'll be relayed here to me via Caroline as well. So we've got multiple layers of mediation coexisting and connecting together in order to make this happen. Oh, this is always going to be a very subjective response. It's probably down to my own kind of personal tastes. But I mean, the poet that I just read from, I suppose Martin Harrison would be the person that I would go to first of all. I should first, I suppose, in responding to this question, admit my failings as far as knowledge of Australian poetry goes. I know about 5 Australian poets and I know them exceptionally well, rather than knowing lots and lots of poets to choose from. So Martin Harrison, Robert Adamson is another poet who would be worth looking at in this regard. But yeah, once again, I don't have a huge sample to grab from. I just know these poets, these particular poets, very well, and I can connect them to lots of different things. But I don't have a kind of encyclopedic knowledge of Australian poetry to draw from myself. But thank you for the question. Well, I suppose yes. I mean, it depends how you say the moan. If the poet was speaking the poem and saying moan like that, I suppose it could definitely be onomatopoeic. So yes, I would say. So. I'm not familiar with that poem of Auden's myself. I do know Auden's poetry, and I think he's an excellent poet to be reading. But yeah, that would be my response to that. I hope that was all a kind of a relevant and intriguing, slightly intriguing presentation, and I hope you kind of next time cicadas are buzzing in the summer heat, that you kind of perhaps pay some heed to their voices and their place making capacities.